it makes Indiana Jones a more interesting character inherently when you give him this relationship with his father. And it makes the character of Henry Jones Sr. more interesting when it's like he actually thinks he was a good dad and he doesn't see the problems here. And like, hello, and welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot, the podcast by storytellers for storytellers so that we can tell better stories ourselves. Today we have back with you our host, Maverick Dixon, except he's co-hosting this time once again as we continue our journey through the Indiana Jones, I guess, series at this point, not really a trilogy. Talking about Indiana Jones and the third installment, The Last Crusade. This is a 1989 action-adventure film story by George Lucas and Menno Meyjes. We're going to say I said that right. Screenplay by Jeffrey Boehm and directed by your favorite, Steven Spielberg. Before we get into the actual meat of this podcast, though, which is dissecting the story, let's get some of those... We'll do the summary afterwards. Let's get some of those initial thoughts, impressions, and rating first and foremost.
Yeah, I mean, as regards to a Indiana Jones film, it's really interesting to see how they developed this one off the back end of the last film. As we discussed in the last one, there was some level of backlash based on the last one for how dark it was, which we even discussed whether or not the humor detracted from the overall film and how the darkness maybe is something that wasn't palatable to the type of audience they were trying to go for. But in this one, they really delved right back into the original maybe intent that they got with the first film and kind of doubled down on that and took some of the ideas of that one. And honestly, they developed them more in this one and made a lot of really, especially symbolic ideas and really elongated those in this one in a really interesting way. So I actually really enjoyed this one particularly in all of the Indiana Jones films that I've watched so far, to the degree that I might even say this one is my favorite Indiana Jones film. I gave it a 7.05.
Wow. Yeah, I thought this film did an actual good job of giving Indiana Jones development, of giving other characters in the film an arc and challenges as they progress throughout the film. Wow, who would have thought they could do that with an Indiana Jones film? It turns out
shocker.
Action adventure films can have a good plot other than indestructible rafts flying out of the back of an airplane. So I thought it was actually great in terms of the film that ended up coming out of it. I enjoyed the film on top of, I think, it being an objectively good film. I think there are good themes and messages here as well. My overall rating was a 7.01.
What? Wow, that's crazy.
So almost a perfect 7. I was just going to say 7, but when you said 7.05, I was like, I got to put the 0.01 in there. So
yeah. That's crazy. Oh my gosh. I don't even, man. Wow, wow, we are aligned. Either this is going to be freaking short or we're going to have some really, just absolute glazing thoughts on this one.
Yeah. I mean, might as well glaze it because I don't think we're going to be glazing the next two. And we definitely didn't glaze the first two. This series quite literally just has like a perfect peak.
Yep.
Anyways, with that out of the way, why don't you give the people listening at home or in their cars or wherever they may be a summary of the film?
Yeah, so this film starts out with young Indiana Jones back when he was a child, doing his own sort of exploration when he's part of the Boy Scouts, looking for he's going off on basic Boy Scout adventure type stuff, and then he sees some grave robbers engaged in trying to find this crucifix for a man known as Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, and decides that he's going to stop them from robbing this grave site. Instead, believes that it belongs in a museum, so he's going to acquire this crucifix and bring it to a museum where it belongs rather than allowing these people to acquire it. he proceeds to take it and goes on this adventure where you see some of his own development that has led to current day Indiana Jones developed within this little fun arc. And you get this idea that he gets his inspiration to be who he is today from this little adventure. In the middle of that, you see it then fast forwards to the current day, and you see that the current Indiana Jones has now gone on to continue to try to acquire this crucifix from the man who originally acquired it. And there is this big kind of fight that occurs out in the ocean, and he ends up acquiring the crucifix. And this reestablishes him into the film. From there, he is approached by a previous donor for the museum that he generally works for, who says, "Oh, we need your help to acquire the Holy Grail, the lost Grail of Jesus Christ that was sought by King Arthur in the legends and other scenarios like that. And they believe it leads to eternal life." And he wants Indiana Jones to go and try to find it. Their previous archaeologists had been lost in the process of trying to acquire it. And he goes, "This is not my purview. Sounds like fun, but you should get my dad because he's really a specialist in this field, actually, and you should use him instead." And then he gets the bombshell that, "Well, as a matter of fact, your father was the one we hired originally, and he's now lost." And this compels Indiana Jones into the adventure, not only to get the Holy Grail, but also to find his father and save him from whatever fate he had then found. He goes through many different shenanigans as he learns more about what happened to the Grail, finds out that there was multiple clues left along the way. He ends up finding his father, gets captured in trying to save him. They both end up escaping, and they go on this grand adventure to find the Holy Grail while avoiding the Nazis, who turned out to be the people who had also taken his father and were trying to get the Grail at the same time, leading to this final climactic scene where he has to go through these many tests in approaching the Holy Grail that rely on some level of some reverence for God as you try to understand what's going on in the middle of these trials. And at the end of the day, ends up leaving the Grail for the sake of continuing his life rather than trying to acquire all riches. So that's a little summary of it, and there's a lot that goes on in the middle there, but suffice it to say, that's the meat and potatoes of what goes on in this film.
Yeah. A lot going on there. Let's talk about the very beginning, though, that opening sequence. What are your thoughts on jumping back in time to a young Indiana Jones to start this movie off?
Yeah, no, and I think we've talked about openers so much, so like the idea of a good opener is just ingrained in my mind at this point. And there's some of these elements where you have this idea of you have a character we already know. How are you reestablishing them in a way that we can relate to them and understand their competencies, understand their weaknesses, and also reestablish for us as the audiences that this is the character we know and love that we've seen before. We've seen this previously, especially with the Marvel films, which is why it's so ingrained in our minds, I think, because we've seen so many both decent examples, great examples, and also terrible examples of how this can play out, especially when you're reestablishing a character we already know. And this one, I think, does it pretty decent. Because, I mean, for one, he wins at the very beginning, which is a stereotypical reestablishment of a competent character, which isn't always, I think, the best way to go about something because you want to lead into the rest of the film. But this one at least had a few things there in that opener which really helped to give us at least a little extra there that reestablish some familiarity and some more or less bonuses, if you will, that we didn't have previously. Some ideas of like, okay, why is Indiana Jones this character who is all about the adventure and also all about trying to find these relics and you seek putting these things in a museum? Well, this backstory about him, played by Joaquin Phoenix, or not Joaquin Phoenix, excuse me, by River Phoenix, is that who it was? Anyways, like, excuse me, but yeah, that's like these things help to establish who. Yeah, it's River Phoenix. These reestablish who he is in a way that gives you this familiarity, like, oh, he has this interaction with this grave robber who's known as Bragg, I think it is, or Briggs. Garth, no, sorry. Hello, Garth. And at the end, Garth gives him his fedora and says, you more or less some level of respect for him for going on this adventure, even though he loses. He's like, hey, you have a future, kid. You're pretty bright. And this gives him this inspiration, like, hey, I can do this. And you see him in that classic fedora every scene in the future. Like, this is his
Mhm.
staple. And then you also see him with the snakes, where at the very beginning he says, it's just a snake. What's the big deal? As his friend is freaking out. And then later on, you see him fall into a pit of snakes and is just absolutely terrified, which makes total sense. If you fell into a whole pit of snakes and that's literally everything all around you, you'd probably lose your mind as well. And so there's these different aspects where it's like, now you understand why he's afraid of snakes. Now you understand why he's all into these adventures, trying to find these lost relics. And so, I mean, it wasn't necessarily leading into the main thrust of the film per se, but it added the reestablishment of the character in a way that also gave us some new insight into who he was as a character, that gave also some level of enjoyment for him and respect for where he came from.
Yeah, I like the opener. I think it does a good job in several areas. One, it does a good job of jumping straight from young Indy to older Indy almost seamlessly in a way that it still, I would count it as the opener up until the point when he succeeds in getting the relic he's looking for, the crown of or the cross of Coronado. Um, I think it also does a good job of it's so quick that you can almost miss it, but his relationship with his dad is, I think they do a really good job of setting that up, like showing what does that look like, and they only needed like that like 5-second clip of him going to talk to his dad and his dad's reaction. Then you also get a shot of his notebook and what his dad's working on, which then leads into what his dad is actually working on later on in the film. Um, you also get the sense of like, this belongs in a museum. Where does that come from? Indiana Jones' willingness to take risks for things that he deems as worth it too. Like, what is worth the risk to Indiana Jones? I do think it's interesting, and I'm curious to see what your thoughts are. I don't want to jump too far ahead of myself, but I do think it is interesting that the film starts with him lowering himself into a ravine to go after an item. It's smaller stakes than the end of the film, but the end of the film sees him doing a very similar thing, and choosing against it. I don't think it has that much significance in relation to the other, and I'm not nearly convinced that um, the director intended that, if that makes sense. I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the lowering himself, while it might be maybe a symbolic gesture to go after the treasure, right? He goes down into the ravine at the beginning of the film to try to acquire the cross. um it could have some very mild like nods. It could be like if you want to take the meta analysis and say it was like a very clever mild foreshadowing that he had for what was going to happen in the future, I think you could go with that, and it probably is true. Like I generally take the stance that especially when you're writing something, that there's everything is written with some level of purpose, right? Even the scenery that you're in. And so the idea that he was lowering himself into a ravine to acquire this, to foreshadow what was going to happen in the future, was probably an intentional role by the original writers of the story to have that level of foreshadowing. Yeah, I wouldn't deny that. I don't know that it has much meaning beyond that though. So it's not like it's a huge level of foreshadowing, and not necessarily something that anyone would pick up on in the first round around, because it's very innocuous. It's very much built into the scenery that we're dealing with, right? Because they're in the middle of Moab, right? So if you're going to find a lost treasure in the middle of Moab, you're certainly not going to find it in a jungle, because there's no jungles out there. You're not going to find it in a house, because how many houses are in Moab, right? You're going to find it in the middle of a rock. So that's what you get. So there's no way that anyone would necessarily look at that beyond thinking of it as, oh, it's just the sign of where he's at in the current scenario. But I think that, yeah, it would at least be an acknowledgement of the cleverness of the writers in regards to putting that in there.
Yeah. That said, I thought the opener was good. We also get a look at young Indy, which was a fun opener, but it was also an engaging and relevant one, I guess is the right word to use. Like it actually had meaning as the film progressed. So not necessarily in the artifact itself, right, the cross, but more so in the way that the events unfolded. So those are my thoughts on the opening scene. I don't know if you had anything else to add.
I mean, the only other thing to add, which is the one thing that kind of took me away from the opener, is I think that the opener is tied intricately to what you see immediately after, when he's an adult trying to acquire the crucifix. And this is just par for the course for Indiana Jones films, but it is a little off the walls in regards to how extreme it is in that scene. And if you're going for, we talked about it to the nth degree, the whole life raft extremity that they had in the last film, and how absolutely ridiculous that was. This did not have that per se, but you see the fact that people are on top of the deck in the craziest of storms, and they're holding a very precious, very small relic as they're going around on the deck. And then there's a massive explosion that you don't even know where it came from exactly, and how the whole thing explodes. It was, off the charts extreme type Michael Bay type excessive explosion type stuff going on. So if you think about that for 2 seconds, you go, okay, that's a little ridiculous. But if you get over that, it's not bad. And that, I think at this point, if you're watching the third Indiana Jones film, you're not thinking too deeply about the crazy things that they're dealing with in these scenarios. But this is probably the most blatant one you see in this film. And it's much more tempered down, I should say, compared to the previous film. So they also had that going for them. Maybe.
So that said, let's get into our discussion around Indiana Jones himself. We've both stated that we think he actually gets an arc in this film. So what do you think that arc is, and why do you find it so compelling? Compelling enough to give it higher than a 7, even if ever so slightly. That is still a very high ranking for you, and for me, to be honest. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the things that go big into this, and this is one of the reasons why the rating system ties certain elements so strongly together. I mean, we talked about this a few weeks ago with the film Michael, and how there was a couple things that were not super good in that film, even though it's a biographical film, so you're limited in that type of film. But one of the things they did very well, which also gave it very high marks in regards to that element, was the motive, right? And how does the motive tie into how much we as the audience care about what's going on in the film? And if you have a really good motive for the protagonist, we have a lot more buy-in as the audiences to be invested in the film, to see them succeed, because we know what they're fighting for and we know why they care. In this film, you get a lot more of that than you do in the previous ones, to a much more relatable degree, even, because in especially in the second one, but even to many degrees in the first one as well, you get this idea that Indiana Jones is this fun-loving adventurer who's out to seek his fortune out in the world. And this one, it still has some degree of that, right? He's still going out seeking adventure, but he also has this extra element of his father being involved. And even though he has some level of strained relationship with his father and some level of misgivings about how he was raised and what his father did for him, he still feels compelled to be involved in this plot because he sees that his father's life is at risk, and this is a huge compelling element for him to be involved in this plot. And so he originally rejects the call to go out on this adventure because he goes, this is not my purview. And in many ways, he had already gone somewhat down this path. I mean, he had done a very similar expedition, and in more ways than he even knew at the time, because he didn't know the Nazis were involved in this one. But in regards to the Raiders of the Lost Ark, he had already dealt with a relic that had to deal with the ancient god of the Bible previously, and he knew that the consequences that dealt with that. And he goes, I don't think so. I'm good. You should go find someone else to do this. In fact, I have the perfect person for you, my dad. And then that's when Donovan, the guy who's trying to hire him, goes, well, that's who we already hired, and now he's gone, so we need somebody. And that's where you get the emotional stakes, right? He goes, there's more than just me involved in this. My father's involved in this, and this adds an extra element where it becomes very personal for him. And this makes it a lot more relatable to us as we realize if something's personal, you want to see them succeed in that because there's a lot higher stakes emotionally for the character.
Yeah. No, I think at its core, the involvement of his dad is the biggest improvement for his character. And we'll get to talking about his dad when we talk about side characters, but there's some mention that needs to be had for his dad's involvement when it comes to talking about Indy. First and foremost, you start to see that Indiana Jones is not this perfect character when it comes to his dad, right? This is his character flaw, if you will, his insecurities and the stuff that he was lacking when he was growing up and how he compensates for that. And then you get that even in that dialogue, right, he has with his dad when they're on the blimp, and he's like, we never talked, Dad. And he's like, okay, well, I'm here. What are we going to talk about? And he's like,
yes.
I don't know.
And he just stares at him.
And like,
and then he's like, well, what are you complaining about?
Yeah.
He's like, up with anything in the moment.
Yeah. It's so good because it's so relatable too. Like, it's just such a real moment between this father and son who have become estranged over the years, right? Mm-hmm. So
well, it highlights so many great things. Maybe getting a little bit ahead, but like the idea is, like in that scene, Henry Jones Sr. is sitting there, and he thinks he was a fantastic dad. He wasn't like strong arming his son in a lot of ways. He let him do a lot of what he wanted to do. He thought that he was, giving him the best life he could possibly give when he was a father for his son. And his son, on the other hand, thinks, you were never there for me. Like, we never had conversations. How were you really raising me if you weren't around and doing things with me? And so you have these two worlds collide, and both worldviews are coming to clash, and neither side is really willing to give, because the one side says this and the other side says, all right, fine. You want to have a conversation? Let's talk. And in that moment, Indiana Jones just doesn't know where to start. He goes, okay, well, there's so much. I don't even know how to start to like have this conversation. And he just laughs and he goes, I don't know. And then Henry Jones's response is to double down. He goes, well, then what's the big deal? See?
Yeah. He's like, why are you being such a bum right now? Like, you're giving me this crap for being a bad dad? Prove it.
Right, exactly. But it also just it is perfect for the characters because the dialogue is on point. The characters are both coming clearly from the worldview they hold to, and just at the end, it doesn't resolve it. It just develops who they are as characters and helps us understand where they're coming from their own viewpoints.
Yeah. No, I think he does go through a good arc here. And I think that he actually has struggles, and there are actual stakes for him in this film in relation to his dad specifically. I think this is a good time to talk about side characters since we are talking about Indy and his relationship to his dad. What are your thoughts on characters like Henry Jones Sr. or Marcus Brody? I guess we could talk about a little bit because he is around for the film. I guess Sala is technically around, but I don't think a conversation's really warranted around him.
Yeah, I mean, most of my thoughts on Marcus and Sala are pretty tangential. They're fun characters and they add a lot of fun dynamics to it. But yeah, I mean, they're not the biggest influencers of the plot as much as Henry Jones Sr. is. He's definitely the meat and potatoes of this film for so many reasons. Because while both he and Indy have just this love of these ancient relics and this idea of ancient history and what it brings to life when you have it in front of you in your hands. They've also both come from very different perspectives, where Indiana Jones is also going out for the adventure and he's willing to do what it takes to accomplish the goals, versus you get a much more maybe pacifistic type persona that comes with Henry Jones. And he sees a lot of the things that Indiana Jones is doing, and does not approve. Whether it comes to beating up the Nazis or causing them to get into car crashes or what have you. You see Indiana Jones, and he throws something into the wheel of the biker and causes him to spin off and fly off into the shrubbery, and he kind of laughs. Indiana Jones is like, "Ah, that was pretty good, huh?" And he looks over at his dad. His dad just looks pissed off. He's like, "That is not okay." And you see in that, even though it's hilarious, it also shows the personality of each of the characters, where they go. One of them is totally okay with doing these things. The other one is totally not okay with these things happening. And so it builds these two characters in very different arcs, if you will, of how they believe the world should work and how they believe they should act. And so this back and forth between them really builds a lot into who they are as characters. And you also get a very strong sense of just the reverence, I guess, that Henry Jones Sr. has for these relics that maybe Indiana Jones never had. And they do well with this on 2 points, not just because Henry Jones is much further along in this arc than Indiana Jones is, right? He
Yeah.
he has clearly done way more research, especially into the Holy Grail, and he believes that it is, this cup from Jesus Christ when he was drinking at the final supper, and he believes that it is a sacred thing that needs to be taken seriously. And while Indiana Jones isn't fully down that path, he at least has some level of respect for it. Why? Because he already had this experience in the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where previously he didn't think that these ancient relics had any semblance of the religious aspect of it being a real thing. He thought they were just, scary wives' tales. And at the end of that one, he comes to some realization that, hey, there is some level of the divine here that we need to take into account and respect. And so this one at least starts with that. So it acknowledges the previous films, but it also takes it much further, as he has to wrestle with that, especially when he gets to the end of the film.
Yeah. No, I mean, this might end up being a shorter one because I don't have much to add. I mean, it's not. I think the thing is with this film is it's not like an incredibly deep film, but
Sure.
it's just done so well that it hits all of the marks, and it goes. It doesn't just hit them; it actually executes them in such a way that is compelling, both as the viewer, whether you are like fully able to acknowledge it or not. I think the fact that it's present makes it inherently more compelling, even for those who aren't consciously going, "Oh yeah, he's going through this transformation." It makes Indiana Jones a more interesting character inherently when you give him this relationship with his father, and it makes the character of Henry Jones Sr. more interesting when it's like he actually thinks he was a good dad and he doesn't see the problems here. And like, right, I think the thing that also just makes it much more interesting to the audience is like there is definitely a vast majority of audiences who can empathize either as a parent to both the parent and Indiana Jones, as you had parents yourself, whether or not you have kids now, the disconnect that may occur. Like a parent thinks, I'm doing what's best for my kid, therefore I'm a good parent. And the kid's going, no, you're not. You're not seeing what I need as your child from you. And so Henry Jones Sr. is like, I was a great dad. I taught you everything you need to know. Look how successful you are. Obviously, I did my job right. And Indiana Jones is like, no, you gave me tools that I needed, I guess, but I think that the best way for me to articulate it is like, yeah, you gave me the tools I needed, but the way that you parented me, you could have substituted you for anyone else. I didn't have a dad. I had like a teacher, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think phenomenal supporting cast. Also, it's Sean Connery, so it's a great actor. Um, I mean, Marcus Brody and Sala, right? They show up, they do what they need to do. Marcus Brody provides some great comedic relief. It's kind of like, I mean, he's basically the helpless woman in this film. They needed someone to take that role. And then Sala, like that. Enough said there.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the antagonist, though. Who would you say is the antagonist in this film?
I tagged two people particularly for this, and they're distinct enough that I wanted to isolate them separately. Hitler, no, just kidding. Although Hitler is in this film, but
Little salute is crazy. That's
no,
insane.
no, the no, it's Donovan who is, he is the initial character who engages Indiana Jones to go on this mission, and also engaged his father to go on this mission, and then also Elsa Schneider. I don't know if you want to take each of those in turn, but I think that both of them deserve their own discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I pegged Donovan and Schneider as the two antagonists. So if we want to take those separately, I think one of them's definitely more compelling than the other.
For sure.
And I don't know if you think similarly. I assume you do, given our ratings are almost identical, and thus far we haven't really had a disagreement. But
yeah.
So, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So for Donovan, I think that, and to be clear, when I talked about Donovan, I also lumped the Nazis as a whole into his, just because in many ways he's the ringleader, and all of the Nazis do what he say. And even though he's not necessarily, I mean, he's clearly American, but he's working for the Nazis to acquire this relic. He is the one in control of everything that they do and say. If you take the Nazis involved in there, this is definitely along the lines of just the basic stormtrooper-esque personality for the Nazis, where they go and they shoot, and whenever they're shooting at Indiana Jones, they're kind of crap, and then when they shoot against other people, they seem to be ridiculously effective, and it seems a little convenient, but other than that, they're just the Nazis doing bad things. So
yeah,
you accept that and you kind of move on, and then you deal with Donovan himself. Donovan himself is pretty interesting. He does, I would say, okay, above average as a villain. He easily he definitely out thwarts Indiana Jones in many ways. He starts off by acknowledging him, and you see, especially looking back, as he had this master plan, that he needed two things. He had the means, and he needed the keys to acquiring this relic. And his ultimate goal is to acquire this relic so that he can have eternal life. He wants to live forever. That is his goal. And so he's going to do whatever he can to achieve that. And he has the means of the Nazis. The Nazis are already on this goal, on this quest to achieve all of these ancient relics, to acquire power, to then win on the world stage. So when he sees that he has this opportunity to do that with them, he says, all right, I'll partner with you guys to then have the means to do so. The problem is that he doesn't have the key, and he knows that the Jones have the key, especially when he realizes, which happens before this film starts, that Indiana Jones's father has been doing a ton of research into this. He knows all of the keys and all of the clues that are needed, except for a few, to get this relic. The problem is that these two groups do not work together. They do not like each other. And so he has to come up with a plan to get both of these involved in a way that won't get at least the Jones understanding that he's working with the Nazis. And so this is the game that he's playing. And when you realize that from the back end, you realize how much he's been going through these hoops and working to try to make sure that he gets his goal without compromising himself. And he does that pretty well. I mean, he gets both Henry Jones Sr. involved in the plot, and when he realizes that all he needs is this diary, he goes to find the diary, and he tries to get Henry Jones imprisoned. He gets Henry Jones imprisoned, but he doesn't get the diary. So then he goes, "Crap! I need a second solution." He goes to the sun, right? And so he's playing this game. He's playing it pretty well. He's getting what he needs to get all the pieces in place, and Indiana Jones helps him in this path, unknowing that what he's doing. So he does pretty well. I think the only thing, and this is really minor, so like, and I even see the arguments against it. Maybe you'll bring some counterpoints to me just to have a further discussion on this. But I think that his little line at the beginning, while it's somewhat like poetic and somewhat uh like classic bad guy-esque thing to say, like, oh, don't trust anyone, when he's the one they shouldn't be trusting, it just seems like such a play of your own hand where you go, oh, I am, don't trust anyone, including me, because I'm the bad guy. Ha ha ha. It seemed like if he's really that smart, why would you do something like that? You're threatening to reveal yourself for the sake of having the last laugh, if you will. But other than that small line, I think that he's overall a pretty solid villain. Not necessarily nuanced beyond being clever in his means, but like pretty solid.
Yeah. I think Donovan is probably a weaker part of this film for me because he kind of fit into the almost stereotypical villain in my mind. Like he did not really have, at least from my reading it, he didn't really have depth. It was just basically, aha, I want a powerful relic to give myself everlasting life.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Schneider was much more interesting once it came down to like she actually does revere this relic, similar to how Jones and both Jones actually view this. It's just she's willing to go to greater lengths, and I think she's meant to represent almost like a corrupted version of Indiana Jones, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's like you get that scene at the end where he goes to grab it, or she goes to grab it, and she ends up dying, and then he doesn't grab it like he wants to, and then Henry Jones Sr.'s like, it's just a cup.
Mm-hmm.
You're more important than that cup. People are more important than that cup, which I think also kind of it kind of plays on the previous two films as well, where you get the idea that he doesn't really care about who he hurts in the process, and that's specifically referring to the women that he ends up hanging out with, and then ditching by the time we get to the next film.
Mm-hmm.
I think Marion is probably much more important to this conversation, given that she does show up in the next film. Though I'm gonna be honest, I think the other films undermine this one. So my headcanon is this is the last Indiana Jones film. I think the image of the Jones Jr. and Jones Sr. riding off into the sunset with Sala and Marcus Brody is a great way to finish the trilogy. And I think it leaves us with a more complete arc for Indiana Jones. That said, though, I think that Schneider poses a much better ideological or thematic contrast to Indiana Jones as a character. And
Yeah.
it's also, I appreciated the take or the twist on the female character in this film, because in the previous two, she's a damsel in distress who has no idea what's going on. She's along for the ride, and that's about it. Whereas in this film, she's competent, she's smart, she is just about as knowledgeable as Indiana Jones is on this, since Henry Jones is the one who actually has all of the information on the why am I forgetting what it's called?
The Holy
The
Grail.
Holy Grail, and they're both kind of discovering this as they go. And she is playing to Indiana Jones' weakness, which is women, and she's using that to her advantage. And you get that in the scene where his dad's like, "Shoot her. No one gives a crap. Like, kill her." And he's like, "I can't do it. She's a hot woman." And then she's just
Yeah.
like, this is how we say goodbye in, what is it, Sweden or whatever.
Hmm.
And then he goes, this is how we say goodbye in German.
Yeah.
He's like, I like the, oh, Austrian. He's like, I like the Austrian way better.
Yeah.
um Anyways, all that to say, I think I would put her as the number one antagonist and Donovan below that, with the Nazis kind of just functioning as the goons throughout the film.
Y- yeah, in regards to just the arc for her as like a more nuanced character, 100%. She's much more nuanced. She has a lot more going for her as a character. I think she doesn't necessarily lead to like she's clearly underneath Donovan, which is why I put him as the primary. And to be clear, I agree with you that he's not the most nuanced villain in regards to Donovan. And part of that is because we don't really know why he wants the Holy Grail other than he just wants to live forever. Which, sure, I mean that's like not clearly that's a motivation that makes sense, but it would have been nice to know if there's any deeper meaning to that. So it would have been nice to get a little more development on his part to make him a more fleshed villain compared to just hit the stereotypical I just want power because I want power, or I want everlasting life because I want everlasting life in this film. So yeah, I agree with that for sure on his part. And Elsa, yes, is very, very nuanced. I think one of the things that's interesting about her, especially, is by the end, one of the things that's unique about her is how she even despises Donovan to some way, and you don't necessarily get that fully fledged, but you get hints of it in how she reacts, especially at the end, because she's an archaeologist, she's a specialist in this field, just like Indiana Jones is, and she looks at the various cups, the final test to see, can you determine which cup truly brings everlasting life? And she looks around and she brings the cup with all of the gems and all the jewels, and she says, oh, this is clearly the cup that is fit for a king. And Donovan agrees, and he drinks from the cup, and right before he drinks from the cup, you see that Elsa gives the side eye to Indiana Jones, almost like, did you see that? Do you see what's going on here? And that's just like the small hints that indicate that she actually knows what she did. She didn't just do this because she thought genuinely that Jesus drank from this cup. She chose it because she knew it was the wrong one, and she wanted to get Donovan out of the picture rather than she wanted to truly give him the keys to immortality.
Yeah.
So you get in ideas like that. You see that she's invested in this, but she's also invested in it for herself. It's very clear that she's invested in it for herself, and she's willing to take whatever means necessary to achieve that. So yeah, she's definitely got those nuances, and you see that she clearly wants what she wants, and she's willing to do whatever it takes to get it, and she has this full knowledge, but at the same time she's so desperate to achieve her ends that in some way she's blind to the very thing she should know, such as knowing that it's dangerous to ignore the warnings that the Knights Templar give her at the very end of the film, where they say it cannot cross the threshold, and she goes, well, I'm going to do it anyways, and we're going to figure this out because I can, because this opportunity is right in front of me. And so there's things like that that really develop her as this nuanced character who is clearly a villain, but she has these ideas around her that fully fledge her into something that is a danger that Indiana Jones has to fight against.
Yeah, no, I think the antagonists are actually good in this film. They're not like the best antagonists we've ever seen, but we also gave this film a 7, not an 8 or a 9. So um how did you feel about heightened tensions? Did you feel like this film consistently put our protagonist from a good or bad situation to worse, with irreversible consequences that he had to deal with as the film progressed?
They do decent at this point. I think that you look at overall the issues that Indiana Jones has to deal with, and a lot of times he is dealing with a worse situation to some degree, with a few spots in the middle where he has a bit of breathing room as he has these discussions, and I will caveat that by saying that they utilize that time, and we'll get to that in a second. But there is some ebb and flow to the tension in the middle of this film. But overall, he finds out that his father, he's tasked with this adventure. He rejects the call, and then he finds out that his father is involved, and all of a sudden the stakes are raised as he realizes that there is personal investment in this. Right, he goes on the adventure, and he goes down to find the spot of the second Templar, only to be attacked by this mysterious group that's trying to kill him, who's protecting the Grail. He finds his room ransacked, and all these other things, and he gets this warning, more or less, that his father's in this place that's in the middle of, right next to Germany, right? And he's like, well, that's kind of weird. Why is this going on? And he goes off to there, and he goes to save his father, finds out that he's involved in a Nazi plot. And then he tries to save his father only to get captured, right? That makes things worse. And then, he gets out of that only to go off to try to find the Grail, and has various situations where he's about to die and ends up getting out of those, only to then come to the final situation where his father gets shot. And all of these things are in some ways, not necessarily, they slowly ratchet up the tension, if you will, throughout the middle of this. So it's not a perfect one-to-one, if you will. It's not like a hockey stick where it goes completely up and it's riveting with tension, but it's got a lot of dynamics where there's these aspects of him trying to figure it out, and it gets worse as he gets further and further into the plot. So it does fairly well. And in the middle of those times where it's a little bit maybe weaker in regards to the tension, they utilize that time to have these discussions between Henry Jones Sr. and Indiana Jones as they discuss the meaning of the Grail and the meaning of their relationship, and about how these things are important to them, and having this dichotomy between how his father sees things and how he sees things, and trying to reconcile these two worlds together.
Yeah. No, I think the tensions were done well. I was thinking about the irreversible consequences element of the film. I don't really know if there are any irreversible consequences. His dad getting shot is kind of framed as that. But he gets the water of life, if you will, that can save his dad, so it does get reversed. I was also thinking about maybe the loss of Elsa Schneider and the Holy Grail, but that's like so far into the film that it's literally like 5 minutes before the ending or less. That I don't think it really functions as part of increasing tension. So I didn't give it full points. Obviously,
No.
It's not a perfect rating. But because I don't think there are actual irreversible consequences for things that happen, and I think that kind of reflects the similar ideas we've encountered with the previous two films. Which, by the way, we didn't really talk about this, but there are still some incredible feats of strength that Indiana Jones pulls off in this film, or just pushes the boundaries of belief. Specifically, the opening scene, right, with the ship blowing up and him just being like, before it even blows up, just going, I'm gonna just jump into the ocean. And we don't even know how he survives. He just shows up at school the next day. So we don't know what kind of superpowers he has, but my guess is they just didn't show him because, I don't know why.
And then he flew into the sky like Superman and got back home.
Yeah. Turns out that cross was actually a powerful relic that gave him superpowers when he's holding it. And that's why he's wanted it for so long. There's a couple other ones too, with just like moving really, I forget what, it was the beginning when they're going into that crypt, and he just like pushes massive stones out of the way. And I remember pointing it out to you, and you're like, no, that's not that difficult. And then you sat there for a minute, and you're like, never mind that. Yeah, that's there's no way a normal human's doing that.
You just look at how thick those bricks are, and you go, there's no way.
Yeah, they're huge. They easily weighed several hundred pounds, and he's just like,
done.
And then just like wading through petroleum and being dry afterwards.
Yeah.
Anyways, all that to say, tensions were increased enough to make it believable, and I think the themes and messages and the development that they had for the characters was enough to offset that. Speaking of themes and messages, what are your thoughts? Do they exist? How many are there? If they do exist, were they done well and executed in such a way that it was satisfactory?
Yeah, I mean, like the two main ideas I saw in this film as it progressed was one about the relationships, but in our lives, specifically in this one, it's the relationship between the father and the son, and these different worldviews, and those coming into conflict, and uniting those together in the midst of a familial bond, and overcoming those differences for the sake of that connection is definitely one aspect of the film. And you see that, especially, even though they don't necessarily overcome their differences by the end, you see that especially at the end when you see Indiana Jones and Henry Jones Sr. both get captured, and Donovan tells Indiana Jones, you need to go into the dungeon, and you need to figure out these clues and figure out how to get past these traps to find the Holy Grail. And he's like, I'm not going to do that. Why would I do that? And then he goes, all right, well, let me give you a reason. And he shoots his dad. And then he goes, well, now you need to save your dad by finding the Holy Grail. You don't have a choice, because otherwise he's going to die. And this escalates the stakes for him. This adds to the tension of the film, but it also makes Indiana Jones realize in that moment this is how much he cares for his father and how much he doesn't want his father to die. And so he is in the moment willing to risk everything to try to help him and help his father survive in that moment. So the idea of familial bonds is definitely one that develops strongly in this film, and it's a very strong theme in this one. The other one that is definitely a strong element, which is even stronger than the previous two, is this idea about the reverence for the divine. And you get that not just because there's a ancient relic with power around it, but you get the idea in how they approach it, in how the only way to overcome some of these obstacles, especially at the end, is to bow to the will of the divine. And then that is where you then achieve the goal, if you will, or you overcome the obstacle, is to literally humble yourself by kneeling or by taking that leap of faith or whatever it is to overcome what is in front of you. And so that is what Indy has to do in those moments. And so he has to go beyond this idea of acknowledging just the fact that the divine might exist, but go to this idea that there is a respect that must be had for the divine, and you have to kneel before it rather than just say, oh yeah, you're there, hello there, mysterious being in the universe. But you need to have a fearful reverence of it, which is also interesting just because, I mean, if you talk about any level of theologies today, a lot of people don't necessarily have a fearful reverence for the divine. And so the idea that there is a very fearful reverence that comes around this film is interesting, because it's not a topic that's talked a lot about in today's day and age.
No, once again, I don't have much to add there. I feel like, is this what you feel like sometimes when I say things and you go, oh, I could just repeat what Andrew said? Or, see, like, I'm gonna be honest, I feel like we do you guys a disservice by watching films that we both like or both dislike. Well, no, both disliking a film is still fine because we can equally trash on it. When we both
You're
like
right.
it, it's usually for the same reasons. And so I either risk sounding like I have I either sound like I have no original ideas and I just repeat what you say, or I just don't talk as much, which, is always a painful thing for me to do. So,
I know it's hard for Andrew not to talk.
um,
Anyways.
So what did you think about the lasting impact of this film? With that in mind, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if anything, it's interesting just because clearly when the the way this film ends, right? There's a lot of arcs that come to a very clear conclusion in this one, both in regards to Indiana Jones' acknowledgement of some of the themes that go on in this one, but also in regards to Indiana Jones' arc as a person, especially in regards to that ending scene where he deals with trying to grasp the grail, right? And when you see his father say, just let it go, right? And in that moment, he realizes that he doesn't need the grail. He doesn't need to continue this adventure and try to pursue this end that he doesn't really need. And he finally does let it go. You see that he's come to terms with the fact that not every adventure is worth I guess, winning at, if you will. And so this is I think a very healthy arc for anyone to go through, this idea that sure, you should strive for things and seek for things, but there's some times where something really should like you should consider the cost and realize that maybe it's not worth sacrificing everything for, and you don't want to risk all of your life and everything you've done for the sake of it. And this is, especially for an adventurer like Indiana Jones, a hard thing to come across when this is everything that your life is built on. But when you acknowledge that fact, it's a very valuable and healthy lesson to learn. And so the fact that that's how the film ends, and then they ride off into the sunset, is an adequate adieu, goodbye to this character. So the idea, when you stated the fact that, oh, I don't really count any movies after this, it makes a lot of sense to me, because and not even having seen the other ones, not that I'm necessarily opposed to seeing the other ones, but it just never got around to it. But beyond that, it's just his arc in many ways had a full completion in this one. So I didn't see the need of having a further film based off of what we know of Indiana Jones. So I think that in many ways it created that perfect bookend for him as a character, compared to from the first one we saw with Raiders of the Lost Ark all the way down to this one in The Last Crusade. They ended it excellently, and I think that was reflected in the awards it got. I mean, it was nominated for multiple Academy Awards. It was, I believe, the best-selling film of that year. It was well renowned at that time, and it was so well renowned, as a matter of fact, that they made another film 20 years later with Harrison Ford for the same character, when they decided they started wanting to milk series for the sake of making money. So I think that the fact that they waited 20 years and made more films speaks for itself in regards to how impactful this film was.
Yeah, no, I think that, like, you clearly see that they completed this arc with The Last Crusade, right? These came out in relatively short time frame, and then they come out with the fourth, and then later they come out with the fifth, which came out maybe a few years ago now. Still haven't seen the fifth one. I saw the fourth one once. It was not good enough to ever watch it again until now, when we're going to be reviewing it again, and I'm going to have to rewatch it, because honestly, all I remember about that was Shia LaBeouf's character was Indiana Jones' son. So,
Surprise.
Oh, and he really liked to comb his hair too. He had like a little comb he kept in his pocket and was constantly brushing his hair. Anyways, I think this is an example of where they should have just stopped with the third one. And there's other examples too of where they should have and they didn't. And there's examples of where I think they did. They should have and they did stop. And I think Back to the Future is probably an example of where they made 3 and stopped. And then there's examples of where they shouldn't have and they kept going. And I think Tron is an example where Tron Legacy was a massive success. Tron Ares not so much. So I think the question that needs to be asked is there a story worth telling if you're going to continue it? And I think that's going to be the answer we're going to provide, I guess, for ourselves anyways, when we get to the next 2 films, were these stories worth telling enough to justify a continuation of this franchise?
Yeah.
Did you have any final thoughts other than that? Those are my closing thoughts. I think this film's great. I think it's a great note to end it on. And I think that any films following this need a really good reason to exist, other than just we want to make another Indiana Jones film.
No. I mean, the only thoughts about this one is, when I finished it, this is one of the few films, and I'm pretty critical on rewatching films at this point, partially because I mean, I watch a ton of films, so usually I'm trying to watch something new. There's so many good things out there, but this is one of those ones where if I didn't want to just explore something new, but I wanted to watch something that I knew I enjoyed and knew I would enjoy the film regardless, this is definitely one of those films, right? I would go back to it in a heartbeat and just rewatch it because it's so enjoyable. They play it out super well. There's so many many great scenes, such great dialogue in it, which, I'm such a sucker for good dialogue. So I was just absolutely loving it. There's so many good things about how they portrayed this film, even though it's not a super deep or complex film. It has a lot of great things going for it. And so it's just a great thing to put on if you have an open evening.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, we will be back next time with the next installment in the Indiana Jones series, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Tune in to hear what our thoughts are on that film and whether or not it was worth it to continue on in the Indiana Jones series.